My communication is entitled 20th Century Traditional Regionalism by French aristocratic writers Jean de La Varande and Alphonse de Chateaubriand, a waning imaginary of belonging. Hereby you have the outline of today's presentation, and in the following communication, seeing that there are very few official translations of my authors and of the consulted books, I've done most of the translations myself, except for a few exceptions that were already in English or where there was an official translation. According to William Marx, in his work on arrière-garde, after the example of Thomas Favel, literary history attaches too much importance to forerunning tendencies while neglecting past continuities. Carrying extensive baggage consisting of a long-time social, historical, cultural and intellectual heritage, the 20th century French aristocracy and especially 20th century French aristocratic writers commemorating their traditional system of values represent a social and cultural minority in a modern era characterized by changes of all kinds in rapid succession. Given that, according to Marx, the arrière-gardes in both of its meanings of the 20th century are often overlooked, a case study examining two scarcely studied authors, examples of 20th century aristocratic professional writers who are strongly determined by handed-down aristocratic traditions, such as life on the family domain, ardent Catholic faith, chivalrous inclinations, would benefit this study domain. The aristocratic imaginary displayed in France, after 1789 that is, tends to characterize itself by the idea of a social decline, more precisely by a decadence, to which these aristocratic authors seem to oppose their values. In order to resist the decadence of their present, the studied aristocratic authors turn toward a more preserving countryside, the province, within their respective literary oeuvres. This communication will therefore focus on two currently forgotten French writers of provincial noble birth, producing a traditionalist oeuvre in a continually evolving first half of the 20th century, Jean de La Varande and Alphonse de Chateaubriand, and I might add it's not the famous Chateaubriand, the 19th century one, whose name is also spelled differently, analyzing their 20th century traditional regionalist novels and short story collections set in bygone aristocratic heydays on the French countryside, a rural setting not associated with the idea of evolution in modernity, will allow for the study of their social as well as temporal and spatial paratopic attempts to relive an ending world. With the 20th century nobility constituting a diverse class, despite the general misconception of their homogeneity, it are the provincial nobles who are characterized most by their close, long-time relationship to their environment, set in time as well as in space. As a result, they provide an excellent impulse for a debate concerning the connection between their social and symbolic capital as rendered by their aristocratic imaginary, the link with time, temporality and history in La Varande's and Chateaubriand's regionalist oeuvre, displaying a thematic of return and a love for tradition, will be dealt with in function of their system of values and with regard to their class's particular ideology. In brief, these traditional regionalist authors' nostalgic relation toward the past will be studied in view of their social descent, their landed aristocratic heritage, being a parameter for their aristocratic imaginary. Born 10 years apart from one another, it's the older Alphonse de Brébenbec de Chateaubriand who first starts publishing his novels, short stories, autobiographically inspired material before the First World War. His first novel, Monsieur des Lourdines, telling the story of the clashing relationship between a melancholic country nobleman and his dandy son, reaches an extensive reading audience and wins him the Prix Goncourt in 1914. It's only well after the end of the First World War, in the 1930s, that the younger La Varande starts publishing his short story cycles, novels, biographies, regional portraits, starting with his critically acclaimed short story collection Pays Louche in 1934. So even though their literary paths do not coincide entirely, they're often identified together in one and the same breath as traditional regionalists. Indeed, they both display an overall consciousness of and loyalty to their respective birth regions, the Vendée region, as is the case for Chateaubriand, and the Norman territory for La Varande, two rural settings where long after the official social disappearance of hereditary aristocracy in France, the nobility has fought to maintain its traditional way of life and isolation from the city, symbol of modern civilization, or to put it in historian Arnaud Meyer's words, even in France, where the Ancien Régime was pronounced legally dead between 1789 and 93, it kept resurfacing violently and lived on in many ways for more than a century, with the rural nobility in the lead of this effort to prolong their class's existence and accompanying lifestyle. It's precisely this struggle for continuation, preservation, that is at the heart of both writers' productions, in which an overall aristocratic caste, to borrow a more cinematic term, ranging from humble country noblemen to dukes, counts, and lords, gives voice to their resistance to change, which in turn can be considered to be the literary expression of the noble author's own nostalgia for their class's past glory days. As a reaction to their present perceived as decadent, their fictional works glorify a past crowded with provincial aristocratic characters who fight as rural noble rebellions, the Chouans, to uphold their isolated rural lifestyle in a 19th century Norman province, as is often the case for La Varande, or who fight to uphold a religious tradition rooted in isolated scenery where Chateaubriand is often concerned. And I quote, "One frequently talks of environment today, yet we easily forget that environment is not just set in space, it is also set in time, and even more in time than it is in space. We ought to know that environment is first and foremost tradition and loyalty to tradition." In this manner, Jean-Albert Boucher describes the motive behind La Varande's entire oeuvre. Such an emphasis on the struggle for preserving tradition, traditional values, in a past time when dynamic forces threaten the isolated rural cocoon, is not just the younger author's literature's main attention, it is also Chateaubriand's focus in his fictional material. Where the latter is concerned, his belonging imaginary is translated by his recurring emphasis on the idea times have changed in works set in so-called paratopic places, that is, linguist Dominique Manguenau's marginal places, used by certain authors to give voice to their own marginal place within society, in interwar publications such as La Brière, La Meute, and La Réponse du Seigneur. In the first of the listed books, it are the swamps of La Brière, in a 19th century time frame that form the environment of the story of the chaser, Aoustin, who, in order to defend his swamps and its commissioners, who reject future and modernity, and in order to safeguard their original liberty, conducts a naval quest. He must rediscover the original patent letters by the Duke of Bretagne, François II. The marginal setting is emphasized by the following description of the swamps at the beginning of the novel, and the map of the world, as far as he's concerned, is divided in two parts, the continents on the one hand and La Brière on the other. La Brière is characterized by its struggle with change, transition. Winter has come with its sea clouds, its rain, its wind gushes that for 8 days now ravage La Brière, a phrase La Varande uses to situate his main character's quest for the isolated area's nobility letters needed to preserve his region's seclusion, that could be interpreted to form a metaphor for the change already afflicting the traditional inhabitants of the swamps, who, just like their representative, are nostalgic about their past. A long time ago, a long time ago, it's lost in the mist, but who have to accept the changed times. Times have changed, Aoustin, says the mayor to his appointed chaser. A bit further in the novel, that same mayor utters, "It is that the skies from the new era have come down upon us and stretch out above our heads. No way to escape them. There is the torment," which results in the dooming statement, "Paradise is lost." That's all I wanted to say. Just like the island, described by Manguenau as a paratopic place in his Le Discours littéraire, Paratopie et scène d'énonciation, Chateaubriand's swamps can also be considered to materialize the constitutive distance of the author vis-à-vis society, especially when taking the noble author's own estrangement from the surrounding bourgeois society under consideration, a feeling of his that was only strengthened after the First World War, where he served as an ambulance driver. Such expressions in a novel set in such a paratopic place, dating from the interwar period, can underline the idea of the author's own paratopic place within modern society. What is more, his ensuing interwar publications, the short story cycle La Meute, taking place in the forests where his own grandfather used to roam, and the novel La Réponse du Seigneur, set in a bucolic atmosphere of Monsieur de Mauvert's isolated forest chateau, with the library bulging with knights' tales and a young man accidentally passing by, yet ending up spending his entire summer absorbed in those knight stories. Those works repeat that inherent struggle with changing times. The times are no longer the same, as Monsieur de Mauvert, the old castle owner, replies to his visitor's request to dine in the kitchen in La Réponse du Seigneur. La Meute is even clearly offered to the audience as a goodbye to a vanishing world, where the grand functions, the grand charges, the grand opportunities are over, as he states in the first person in his preface written in a hollow road. All this age allows for is a goodbye, and this book is one built on memory. It is a memory, and I offer it to memory. Where Lavarande is concerned then, his literature emphasizes that same nostalgia for a past era, seeing that his works take place in the Northern region following the French Revolution, a period of time marked by those Chouans, those rural noble rebellions, fighting to uphold their ancestors' traditional way of life from before 1789 on the country in a symbiotic relationship with their fellow countrymen and with a shared responsibility toward God. Lavarande comes across as a safekeeper of his class's way of life by writing down his fictional stories presenting aristocratic characters, reflecting their ancestors' traditions and shared values. He commemorates his class's past and also lives up to his class's tradition to continue their lifestyle and pass it on to future generations. Sociologist Monique de Saint-Martin talks of this typically noble practice to uphold and pass on their history in her work, L'Espace de la Noblesse. It is that within the noble class, across generations, a well-connected whole of traditions and souvenirs is continued, and Maurice Halbwachs precises further, the history of the nobility is certainly not the entire history of the nation, yet nowhere else can one find a similar continuity of life and thought, nowhere else a family rank is defined by what they and the others know of their past. Lavarande as the bard of his region's past, who, starting from his first publication onwards, emphasizes, similarly to his fellow traditional regionalist, that nothing should have changed since the 16th century, but that nevertheless times are changing, his country is changing, all the while stressing his region's singularity by occasionally throwing in some lexical particularities, such as the different spelling for bien sûr in l'émanant du roi, or gore instead of encore in pays douche, or the use of the verbe to say yes in le sourcil vert, or even a specific proverb such as the one he uses in his 1937 novel Nid Cuir. The past time is your parent, the present time is your lover, yet the future is your child, which in turn underlines the just cited typically noble custom to pass on his ancestors' traditional values to future generations. At this point, the work on justification, economies of worth, by sociologist Boltanski and economist statistician Thévenot can be employed. In their representation of different worlds and the values attached to them, their analysis of the domestic world shows a similar emphasis on ensuring the permanence and continuity of tradition, which they summarize by using the following Chinese proverb: if you don't sing the praises of your house, it will fall down on your head. The domestic world analyzed by this duo discords with the industrial world according to their description of it. In the domestic world, objects are not apprehended according to their own worth, as is the case in the industrial world, but essentially according to how much they contribute, establishing hierarchical relations among people. It's precisely that sense of hierarchy, in addition to the importance of one's roots, that is lacking in the modern industrial world, which in turn could be seen as an equivalent of the first half of the 20th century society, in which the nobility no longer fits, or to put it in historian Bartia's words, culture, starting from 1914 onwards, lives in the liberty of being uprooted, while the grand world only lived in a world determined by its roots. In this uprooted dynamic society, Lavarande commemorates an ancient France characterized by its hierarchies, traditions, and he does so in the entirety of his oeuvre. The title of his in 1938 published short story cycle, L'émanant du roi, telling the story beginning in 1793 and not ending until 1950 of the last Chouans and their profound relationship with their country and all of its inhabitants, their continued love for the nobility and the accompanying lifestyle, stresses a key factor involved in all of his writings. Manant stems from the Latin maneo, meaning I stay, I preserve, and I wait. Indeed, Lavarande lingers over the chivalrous adventures of the last Chouan families, inspired by real Norman noble figures from the past, and as such it is Lavarande himself who becomes the one who stays in, waits in, and in this manner preserves his ancestors' past. And I end this presentation with some notions on anti-modernity and traditional regionalism. And I quote, "As Maritain du Bosat conceived it, the anti-modern epithet qualified a reaction, a resistance to modernism, to the modern world, to the cult of progress, to Bergsonism as well as to positivism. It indicated doubt, ambivalence, nostalgia, more than a pure and simple rejection." That is, among other definitions, how anti-modernity is defined in the opening pages of Les Antimodernes de Joseph Maistre à Roland Barthes by Antoine Compagnon. Even though his definition of anti-modern does not coincide entirely with Lavarande's and Chateaubriand's anti-modernity, there are some points of convergence. It's precisely this idea of nostalgia, of a resistance toward change, that can be found in the respective oeuvres by the self-described mist painter, chaser of images in the salt pans of Sailly and the forests of Landes and Lanvaux, and by the as such identified writer of loyalty, bard of the Ouche country. Moreover, the traditional regionalists at hand want to familiarize modernity, their contemporaries and their future generations with a disappearing traditional culture, and as a result, they reveal an eagerness to reconcile past, present, and even future. Lavarande, for instance, wants to bring his contemporaries and future generations closer to his classes and region's glorious past. In his literature, a phrase like "this castle of the Bar family," where past and present are so intimately intertwined, which can be found in his Cantor de Dieu, dealing with the struggle between a flesh and a spiritual experience. Such a phrase indicates such a reconciliation between the past and the present, a reconciliation he wants to pass on to future generations. Chateaubriand's letters to his wife and friends from the period disclose his determination to reconcile the world, in particular Europe, in the complex interwar period. He believes that contemporary Europe can be reconciled by leaning on their shared pillar from the past, Christianity. Even though his contemporaries seem to have lost it at the time, he wants to help return that Christian form of humanity in order to reconcile past, present, and future, and as such unify Europe by focusing on it in his literary oeuvre, starting with his novel La Réponse du Seigneur. Father Philiberto was not wrong when he wrote, La Réponse is an act in itself. It proves to our era of total confusion that the peoples in search of organization and pacification forget that there is one force that can carry them out of that abyss, Christian faith, generating for the hearts and spirits light, courage, and sacrifice. Chateaubriand and Lavarande are anti-modern writers who produce a traditionally regionalist oeuvre marked by their glorification of a finishing, more traditional way of life, which at times is opposed directly to that changed, more dandy, city-based lifestyle. As such, in Chateaubriand's first novel, Monsieur Deslourdines is the prototype of the country nobleman, descending from an ancient noble family who prefers roaming in the woods, close to nature, to city life. He's the opposite of his spoiled, spendthrift, dandy son who prefers the city over a rural life, whom he tries to reconvert to his traditional country nobleman's way of life. Similarly to this character, Monsieur Deslourdines' efforts to preserve his vision of an ideal way of life, one can wonder whether Chateaubriand's own mission, by portraying his aristocratic imaginary situated in a bygone rural setting, is not a comparable determination to preserve at least a part of his class's ideology. That same hypothesis goes for Lavarande, who is identified as the direct successor to 19th century noble and Norman writer Barbey d'Aurevilly. This 20th century Norman author even presents Barbey d'Aurevilly as a dandy character in his 1943 novel L'Homme aux gants de toile, which he puts forward as having been written in the same period as Monsieur Deslourdines. Explicitly identified as dandy at several occasions throughout the book, the character of Barbey d'Aurevilly has returned from Paris to visit the Count of Loigny and Madame de Tallard in his beloved Normandy. The Count and the dandy indulge in telling each other some local diabolical legends as prophets of the past, all the while also discussing the latter's published books, which leads to Madame de Tallard declaring her preference to her hereditary, loyal, and convinced neighbor over Don Juan, Lord Byron, and Brummel. This side story evokes the posture of an author who functions as a prophet of the past himself, and in this manner, via his aristocratic imagery, conditioning a nostalgic relation toward the old Normandy, intends to preserve a past which could be considered to be an inherent part of a certain ideal proper to his social class. In sum, Alphonse de Chateaubriand and Jean de Lavarande represent two French authors of provincial noble birth who, in the midst of a dynamic society in more than one way, stand still and evoke the histories of their ancestors' regional lives, with stories taking place in isolated settings from the previous century. The quoted paratopic places are the author's own isolated places within the early 20th century society that are being brought to mind, nobility being a lead for paratopy. That impossible place, belonging at the same time as not belonging, has resulted in these authors reconfiguring their works in function of that social referent that's also theirs. As such, their productions render their difficult, marginal position in the first half of the 20th century, which results in them going back to their roots in space and in time. It's not surprising that these traditional regionalists choose their birth provinces as settings for their stories, seeing that such an environment was more preserved from the decadence to be found and more associated with city life. In the first half of the 20th century, the province is in itself spatially as well as temporally paratopic. Moreover, the nostalgic contents expressing a deep love for tradition, captured by noble characters from previous times in rural settings, enhance their anti-modern status or even Arya-Guard feel. By telling these stories, they're not only the painter or the bard of their ancestral past, reconciling past and present, and even passing on in this manner tradition to future generations, they also bring across a certain ideology granted to a specific finishing landed aristocracy with a particular relation toward time and temporality, and at the same time seem to appropriate that ancient French aristocratic posture for themselves, which in turn induces their specific relationship toward the past. I thank you.